Simon Hill, welcome to Project 100, mate.
Mark, thank you so much.
Good to see you again.
Great to be back here.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, you have been on Straight Talk, and we've discussed a lot of things. Well, more about what you were doing in The Proof. That's your podcast, and all the stuff you put out on your various reels, etc., which is great stuff. I follow it. So anybody listening, you should follow this dude. He knows what he's talking about. It's researched. Maybe he doesn't know, or he does know. Who knows what anyone knows what they're talking about, but it's researched at least, and it has backing, scientific backing, which is going to be one of the points we're going to talk about today. But before we go on, there's no point in me talking about your ability to do research as a person involved in the science of biology, our biology. Can you just quickly tell me what your academic qualifications are? Probably is the best way to start.
Sure. So my first undergraduate degree was a Bachelor of Physiotherapy.
Which means what?
Essentially studying anatomy, biomechanics, how the body moves, what happens during injuries, how we rehabilitate someone. My specific focus was on shoulder rehabilitation, and I was working at Paran Sports Medicine Centre, which is like a private practice down in Melbourne. And then outside of clinic hours, I would work with the Richmond Football Club and Coburg Football Club, their kind of VFL feeder team.
Yep.
And so I was a junior physio there. I'd be helping players manage injuries, build strength, build range of motion, and get back to being able to perform at a high level.
That's quite interesting, because most people probably don't realise how physios fit into the sporting scene. I'm lucky enough to have had some exposure to that in terms of rugby league. But it's two parts. I mean, maybe you were a junior at the time, young guy, but at the game and at training, the physio sort of diagnoses injuries. So if you know what I mean, like something happens, I've got a sore shoulder, and the physio will go up and sort of move things around, sort of get a bit of a sense of what's going on and work out whether the person can continue on, or whether the person should go and see the doc, or go off and get an MRI, whatever the case may be. But also they're really important in the rehab part of things. The rehab includes not just, it depends on whether it's concussion or a physical injury. I guess concussion is a physical injury, but the rehab process is not just about maybe manipulation, etc., which is what most people know physios for, but it's also about the whole package of rehabilitation, food. Do I do is sauna good for me? Should I apply ice to it? There's a whole series of stuff. Is that correct?
Right. And there's acute injuries, but then there's also chronic injuries.
What's the difference between the two?
Acute is, something on field happens and someone tears a hamstring. Right? And then you assess that, you work out, you determine the grade of that hamstring strain, and then you treat that hamstring to get them back to be able to play. But you're also going to look at that person from a diagnostic point of view to try and determine, why did they tear that hamstring? Were they not strong enough? Is it biomechanics related, the way that they're running? And so you try and rebuild that person so that doesn't happen again. Let's take something that's less acute than that. Maybe someone has a stress fracture in their foot. Same thing, like, why has this person developed a stress fracture? Were they just overloaded and their training load was too high? Were they not strong enough? Is their foot positioning not right when they're running? So you're really trying to analyze the person kind of very holistically.
What about nutrition then?
And then nutrition, typically in like a football club environment, you would be working in a team. So you have a sports medicine doc, you have a physio, and then you have dietitians, nutritionists. And, as a physiotherapist, the extent to which you kind of provide dietary advice is relatively limited. Obviously, you're across research around like the healing of connective tissue and muscle. So you might have some input into high-level things like protein and making sure you're getting enough of that through the day. But the specifics are handled by the dietitian. And I would say, as a physio, particularly in the football club environment, that was like a big limitation for me and a blind spot. And it's kind of what then motivated me to go back and do my master's in nutrition science, so that I could kind of provide a bit more well-rounded advice to people.
And what is nutrition science? So It's because we did have Jordan Sullivan on, who has a master's in
Dietetics.
Dietetics, which is a hard word to say. Dietetics. You probably diagnosed me. Mark's probably had too many concussions, but because I can't say the word probably. But yeah, but what's the difference between dietetics and nutritional science?
It's a mouthful, that word. I often get it wrong as well. So
I feel better.
You're not alone there. I mean, these are similar. Depending on the master's degree that you do, it may have more of a clinical focus, a clinical kind of dietetics versus a research focus.
What about you?
And so
nutrition
I focus
versus...
more on the nutrition science, the research side of things. And that's looking at how you use science as a methodology to determine what's the best type of nutrition for various goals, whether it's for sports performance or whether it's for longevity. And so in that type of education, you're learning about different study designs. You're learning about how you use everything from cell culture studies to animal studies to population studies. And there are a broad range of different types of population studies looking at people living in the real world, and randomized controlled clinical trials. So you're taught about all of those study designs, the strengths, the limitations, how they kind of answer different questions, and then how they work together to form the totality of evidence. So you can look at a big picture rather than
form an opinion.
Yeah, rather than a single study, and say, I'm not certain, because science is not about having a deep conviction and absolute and being certain. But what you're trying to do with all of these different types of studies, which are all helpful in their own way, you're trying to reduce uncertainty, right? And that's what public health recommendations on nutrition, they're not definitive, but we're using the scientific method to help get us past the blind spots that we have as individuals. The reason we can't rely on anecdotes is because there's so much bias and so many blind spots. We need a method to be able to reduce that bias, reduce those blind spots, and move closer to a truth, right? Without ever getting to, quote unquote, the truth.
Okay, this is important, and I hopefully I don't bore all our listeners too much by this, but I think this is just important. We just need to sit on this for a moment or two, in the context of what you and I are going to talk about, and actually in the context of health generally, or optimization of health relative to even longevity. It's important because I can borrow from what you said a little bit in terms of finance and economics. We are always trying to build a probability set. In other words, a statistical probability based on the evidence to give us a certain confidence level that what our conclusion is may not be right or wrong. Mm-hmm. It's just it gives a confidence level that it is closer to being right than it is being wrong, mm-hmm. which is I guess what you're saying is no different in what scientists do.
Right. And I think the issue, at least in the online space, is when you use language that's not absolute and has a degree of kind of humility, talking a bit like you just did then. We're talking about confidence. We don't know for certain. In online, that can often be conflated as a lack of confidence. You're not, this person's not the expert on this subject matter because they don't know.
So if someone wants to be some expert on subject matter, what do they do?
Well, what we see, I think there's this conflation where you see the person come online and have this sensational view, very deep conviction.
Strongly spoken.
Strong. And it seems like, oh, wow, that person has really grasped this area of science. But for me, that's a bit of a red flag. I'd rather see someone talk with a little bit more nuance, a little bit more humility and uncertainty. And at least from a science perspective, when I see that, I think, okay, this person is being more objective and is more likely to be providing accurate, reliable information responsibly.
That's as a scientist, but most of us aren't. Mm. And most of the audience, probably the most significant part of the audience, are not. They're punters like me, interested, but not prepared to go and read the abstract, or in fact, even if I do, or just read the publication. But even if I do read the publication, I don't know the methodology. I don't understand any quirks in the methodology or any criticism perhaps around the methodology. Therefore, I won't read it. Therefore, what I'm going to be swayed by is the opinion of the individual. And what sways me in terms of the opinion of the individual is the person's status, the size of the audience. Perhaps I'll look behind and see what their qualifications are. And then really it comes down to their performance. How do they deliver it to me? And as a result of that, I can be convinced very easily, especially with social media, that, wow, this is something I should be trying. And I just want to let's touch on a couple of them. Because one of the reasons I wanted you to come on the show is because you are a person who makes your commentary based on science, because you have learnt the scientific way. In master's degrees and undergraduate degrees, you understand it. Therefore, you're not prepared to make outrageous statements about stuff. Let's just pick a product, for example. Now, what's that stuff called? Methylene blue. I know I must have looked it up somewhere. I probably heard it somewhere. And of course, the algorithm worked out that I may be interested, so it keeps testing me, keeps hitting me up with this stuff. And then I thought, well, maybe I should buy it. And then I did. I actually did buy some online. When I got a bit nervous because I thought, well, hang on, I don't know where it came from. I don't know who makes it. I don't know anything about the provenance of this particular product, irrespective of what it's supposed to do. I don't know about the provenance, so I actually threw it out. Waste of money, waste of time, waste of effort. Maybe give us a bit of a commentary on first and foremost, what are they saying about methylene blue? What's the general consensus about it? I mean online.
The claims, I will say this is not a topic that I have deep dived thoroughly to give you a very thorough answer as to should someone supplement with methylene blue.
So it is a supplement.
I have a view on this. It's high level without having looked deeply. And I'll say, for example, if you came to me, and people often message me in my inbox and say, what do you think about this? And it's some obscure outside of the box thing. Honestly, it probably would take me a month to get through the literature properly to give you an answer.
Well, that's interesting, Simon, because I wonder whether these people who are promoting it, they're usually trying to sell it to me, have actually even looked at the literature. In other words, done a proper literature review.
Probably not. And going back to earlier, you said, we're not all scientists, so it's difficult to kind of know if someone's providing good information or not. I agree that not everyone's a scientist, and we don't expect everyone to have the skills to get into the literature. But I do think you can look at the way someone's communicating and relatively quickly, at least over a matter of weeks, determine if this person is objectively reviewing the evidence. And so using methylene blue, for example.
Well, it's a supplement, right?
It's a supplement. It's a synthetic. My understanding is in the 1960s, it was produced synthetically as a textile dye to dye textiles blue.
Right.
And so it's synthetic. Now, just because something's synthetic does not mean it's bad, right? But that there is an idea out there that anything that's synthetic is definitely bad. And I'd say one thing that I find a little bit ironic, and this is a kind of a pattern to look for when you're looking for good science communicators, is a lot of people that are pushing methylene blue right now, they're the same people that will say avoid all seed oils because they're synthetic, they're not natural. But then, in the other hand, they're telling you to supplement with methylene blue.
Yeah,
you see how there's a logical inconsistency.
Yeah.
If your view is that something that's synthetic is harmful, you can't just treat two things differently.
Yeah, selectively
on the one that you're making money off. Right. So looking for logical consistency is really important when you're looking to see if someone is providing objective or at least consistent advice. Another one you'll often see is someone will use an animal study one day to support something.
Mice or rats.
Yeah. And animal studies have their role. They're usually hypothesis generating. They don't always translate to humans, but they can inform the next stage of science that is conducted in humans. But I'll often see people online where one day they're citing animal studies to support their position, and then the next day they're talking about how animal studies are not reliable and accurate because someone's presented an animal study that doesn't support one of their currently held positions.
What hope has a pundit like me got? So what should I do? What do people listening to what you've just said of which there'd be literally millions, at least in this country, what should they do?
Well, I think when you hear something that's very obscure, outrageous, outside of the box, an alarm bell should go off, right? It might be that it's something like methylene blue. Methylene blue it could be beneficial.
We don't know that.
I don't know. There's not a lot of research on it. But what I would say is if it's outside of the box, while you may get a benefit from it, you're also accepting risk.
Right.
Because everything is a risk reward calculation. And if we don't understand what the true benefits are of supplementing methylene blue, in what dose, for who, for how long, we also don't understand how safe that is or what risks are attached to it. So when something's obscure, for me, it's a little bit of an alarm bell going off. I'm not just going to jump into it and start supplementing with it. I want to see people that I trust who are providing credible information also recommending it. And I would ideally want to see it in the guidelines being recommended.
Guidelines? Which guidelines are we talking about?
Dietary guidelines or consensus papers on supplements, of which, there are consensus papers on supplements that speak about supplements like creatine, where at least, there's evidence of benefit. Magnitude of benefit varies depending on the outcome, but the safety profile is pretty well established.
Whether or not it does anything for you, it's not going to harm you.
Right. So we know that you might get small benefits in certain areas for strength. Creatine, even for cognition. Again, it's even for bone health, but some of this is context dependent. We know that there's bone health benefits observed in postmenopausal women. I can't sit here and say today that you'll get that benefit. I haven't seen that in a study of.
Well, I'm definitely not postmenopausal.
Right. But what we do know is at doses that people are recommending, the safety profile is really good. At worst, someone's going to get a little bit of acute GI upset, and then they might feel some kind of nausea, gut symptoms acutely, and you can reduce that by kind of splitting your dose with creatine and or having it with food, and usually people don't experience that. But in one hand, so creatine has been studied in hundreds, if not thousands, of clinical trials with humans. So looking at what is the efficacy, and we have safety profile data. That's why it's in guidelines from very reputable nutrition organizations, whereas methylene blue is not.
Yeah. So therefore, because as opposed to picking up what's just trending, and like methylene blue is probably trending, sort of creatine is trending a little bit too, but I still don't know how I would pick between the two. I sort of have a better idea, generally speaking, but I'm talking on behalf of normal people. How do you pick between the two? And so how would a normal person say, is it a matter of who do I trust and who has a trusted brand as an individual that talks about creatine relative to, I haven't heard Andrew Huberman talk about methylene blue. I haven't heard Peter Attia talk about methylene blue. I haven't heard you talk about methylene blue, but I have heard all three of you talk about creatine. Is that sort of a better way to look at it? In other words, don't just pick up whatever you see like I did, pick up something on Instagram and order the bloody thing. Go back and maybe if you follow any one of those three or all of those three, go back and just go through their episodes and see if anyone has actually talked about this particular product.
There's a few layers to this. So if you're digesting information online from someone who is providing recommendations, like myself or Andrew Huberman, you're looking for those traits of someone who is speaking with a degree of nuance, context, someone who's willing to change their mind. That's a very good sign. Someone who appears to be logically consistent. But I would go a step further and say, if we're thinking about creatine, and this is one of the reasons why I get domain-specific experts on my show. I've had 2 or 3 different scientists who only study creatine on the show to hear directly from them.
So in other words, people should go and have a look at your episodes and see who you're talking to.
Yeah, and on any of these shows, whether it's Peter Attia's or Huberman or my show or your show, if you're wanting it to hear about the science of creatine, the best source is going to be the creatine scientist who spent 30 years as a domain-specific expert. And that's another sign of another green flag is when you're listening to an expert. Is someone sticking to like their area of expertise, or are they going way out wide?
Yeah.
Right. When people are going way outside of their line of their lane, for me, that's a bit of a red flag. So I would say,
what about if they quote a study? So let's say they're outside of their territory. A lot of people don't always declare the territory, but they're outside of the territory. Let's say, but they have a science background, but they quote a study. Is that dangerous for us to immediately rely upon that study as something that should?
Oh, of course,
yeah,
because you can say study show to just about prove anything.
Yeah,
but as I mentioned before, many times studies in cell cultures or animal studies don't translate to humans.
And may not even translate to me as a human.
And
so
it
the effect on me might be different to you.
Correct. Or you could have a human study that was looking at 25-year-old healthy adults. And without the context of that, to just assume that that's generalizable and translates to a woman or a man in their 40s, 50s, or 60s, there's a big assumption there. So again, if someone's just saying, studies show, it's like, well, what studies and what type of study design was this? If it was humans, like who were they? If we're talking about a food, for example, or a nutrient, it's always like, what was the dose compared to what? Because the thing with nutrition is when you eat something, there's an opportunity cost. You're displacing something else. So you always have to consider the comparator, because you can get a food or a nutrient like saturated fat and make it look really good if you compare it to sugar, or you can make it look really bad if you compare it to unsaturated fats. And so there's all of this kind of
they're all nuances. Therefore, I mean, there is massive rising tide in relation to products and the science around health and longevity or at least optimizing your longevity relative to your genetics and your environment. It's about optimization. Everyone's got a different set of genetics. Everyone's got a different type of environment within which they live, and the ability to do 10 minutes of exercise. You might not have enough time to do 2 hours. Everyone's different, completely different. So I think what I'm getting from this, and it's sort of how I operate, which one of the reasons I got you on, is that I just pick a couple of people in this game, and I pick you and Human and Atia around the optimization of longevity, and I pick people who interview other people who are experts in the particular area. So you don't really rarely get to see Human saying, I'm telling about creatine, but he will get someone who's an expert on it, like you do. And Atia does the same thing. It's just that Peter Atia's stuff is pretty dense.
There's levels to this.
It gets right into the weeds, and it can lose most people because it gets way too scientific outside of most people's realm. But nonetheless, if you're prepared to go through the 3 hours of listening to one of his really long podcasts, you're better off listening to individuals like that. It'd be good if there was a female in there. I'm sure there are, but I don't know who.
Dr. Rhonda Patrick does a pretty good job.
What's her name?
Dr. Rhonda Patrick.
Rhonda Patrick.
She does a pretty good job too.
There's a good female in there if you want to get a different perspective as well, and probably cover off for females, probably the effects on females. I think what we're getting from this conversation, and before I move on, is that don't be swayed. Become curious, but don't be swayed by what you might see on Instagram straight up.
Right. Don't if you're finding yourself scrolling and then day to day, week to week, you're flip flopping back and forth. Like the scientific consensus doesn't change that quickly.
Yeah.
It's probably time for an audit of who you're following.
Yeah.
And go through and look, okay, these are the good science communicators that I trust. I'm gonna really focus on the content they're sharing and the guests that they have. And then one other thing I just quickly add before we move on is I think because your question here is like, what do people do, is a great question. Because and I feel for the everyday person out there who has this avalanche of information and is unsure who to trust, is not feeling empowered. They're not confident in the decisions they're making every day. They're not sure, they have a certain amount of resources. They're not sure where to allocate them. I think, honestly, if we're talking about methylene blue and all these obscure things, we're majoring in the minors. There's a lot of people fighting on the internet about methylene blue who, quite frankly, are not focusing on just eating a good, healthy dietary pattern consistently, are not, trying to get the 2.5 hours of sweat and moving their body every week, are not, focusing on what are the little things they can do to perhaps improve their sleep, how much energy and time are they putting into their relationships. And so if you're finding yourself obsessed and focusing over all of these things where there's a lack of evidence and it's affecting the foundations of a healthy life, where we have just such a broad body of literature supporting the benefits of these things for longevity, I'd come back to the foundation.
So, and the foundations being, which is the whole purpose of this show actually, is the foundations being sleep, exercise, and basic nutrition, and
relationships,
community,
social connection, mindfulness.
Yeah. And they're sort of like the 5 things that, we really need to get right. Get those things right first.
And they all interact with each other.
Yeah, well, they're all dependent on each other. Like they're not separate. They're not mutually exclusive. Right. They're all inclusive. You've got to get all that right. But I think it was important, if you don't mind me, having gone down that rabbit hole a little bit, to talk about context relative to what we're all getting bombarded with. But let's peel back now. Let's get back to the basics. Let's get back to fundamentals. So, and one we hear about a lot is, and this is a consistent theme, we need, in terms of protein, between 1.8 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of our body weight. That's a consistent thing. I've heard it from you, I've heard it from Ati, I've heard it from Human, and like 100 others, okay? It seems to be a generally accepted principle. But there are nuances with that. Age, gender, output, the amount of exercise you do, what type of exercise you do. Can we just talk about this? And then, by the way, where do I get it from? Like, if I eat a 200-gram steak, that doesn't mean I just got 200 grams worth of protein.
No.
It means I got a lot less. So do you mind if we just sort of unpack that a little bit? Let's start with, do you agree with the proposition, generally accepted principle, that 1.8 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of weight, probably per day? But they're not saying you need to do it every day, because today you might not do it, but do you need to catch up tomorrow, or is it per week? What are we talking about?
Consistently, I'd say 1.6 grams per kilogram as the lower end, up to 2.2 grams per kilogram.
Right.
I'm not, a lot of the studies that look at sort of 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram are comparing to the RDA, which is 0.8. grams.
Recommended daily.
The recommended daily allowance or recommended daily intake, depending what country you're from, is 0.8 grams per kilogram.
It's much lower.
It's pretty low.
Yeah.
Right. So we understand that at that 1.6 to 0.8, there's definitely an advantage to being at 1.6 grams per kilogram. I'm not yet fully convinced there's a huge difference between 1.2 grams per kilogram and 1.6 grams per kilogram.
Midway.
In the middle. But I think there's no real downside to getting to 1.6 grams per kilogram.
So if you have more,
there's no real downside. That's a myth that it affects the kidneys. I mean, the downside is that it's probably going to reduce your appetite, which is a good kind of side effect to have. So I would say, it's a pretty sensible idea to focus on 1.6 grams per kilogram
as a reasonable position.
Reasonable position. And if you're falling between 1.2 and 1.6 grams per kilogram, I don't think it's the end of the world. I think the bigger thing to sweat is the stimulus, which is where most people are kind of overlooking, which is the resistance training piece. It doesn't matter how much you ramp up that protein to 1.8 to 2.2 if the stimulus isn't there.
So therefore we should be clear on this. The objective of trying to get to 1.2, 1.6, 1.8 or 2.2, whatever it is, wherever you decide as an individual to go to, the objective is to build strength and muscle and allow you to train.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah. So as we age,
that's the stimulus.
As we age, if we're talking about longevity, and this is another good thing for us to kind of encapsulate here with protein, is what do we care about? Is it are we just focusing on hypertrophy and building muscle? Is that the outcomes of interest, or are we focused on longevity and therefore also cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer risk, dementia risk? right? Because for me, when I look at protein based on my goals, I look at all of that. I'm not just optimizing for hypertrophy. I also want to consider longevity, which is where protein source comes into this equation.
The source of where the protein comes
where
from.
you're getting from the protein package.
Right.
And I think that's often overlooked a little bit in the fitness industry, kind of where I actually came from, originally in my early and mid 20s. So the stimulus that you and I are talking about here that's kind of needed in order to utilize this protein is some form of resistance training, whether that's your body weight or lifting weights. And the body adapts to that. So as you place the body under this stress, let's say you're doing squats, providing you do what's called an effective set. So an effective set in lay terms just means that you put on a given load that got you, and you performed a number of reps to the point where you were within 2 reps of failure. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So in other words, you get to 6 with that given weight on one that's across on the bar, across your shoulders or in front of however you're holding it, and you think, I've only got 2 more. I can't do more than 2 more.
Right. And most people underestimate that. So they think I've only got 2 more, but they probably have like 5 more. That's
2 more, a good structure.
2 more reps.
But a good structure, like really good like form.
I would say 2 reps to failure.
To failure.
Which a lot of people have never felt.
Yeah.
Which is a good reason to use machines. Because like you can imagine going to failure on a squat rack without a spot, it's a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, I won't.
So for a novice lifter who hasn't felt failure a lot, experienced lifters are much better at getting to within 2 reps of failure. It's clear in the literature.
So you don't do, if you get to 2 reps, you don't do the 2 more. You stop at you stop at 6, for example, on the one I just gave. Is that right?
Yeah, training to failure is something else we can talk about, and experienced lifters might intersperse that and build that into their program, but it's not going to be every set.
Yeah.
And for the everyday person thinking about longevity, I wouldn't even focus on that.
No, so because
what I would
talk
focus
about
on is a rep range of between 6 and 10. And I like that rep range because it's a rep range that is going to help you build some muscle, but it's also a strength. And really, as we age, it's strength is the main outcome that we need to be able to navigate our environment and reduce our risk of falls and fractures. So the point that I want to make here is to utilize that protein and get an adaptation to get an increase in
your
strength.
muscles.
Yep, to get an increase in strength to actually promote hypertrophy, so increase
build muscle,
a growth of muscle tissue. You need to get within 2 reps of failure. That's what the research shows. Or else you just haven't taken that set far enough for the body to basically say, hey, I need to adapt. I need to get stronger.
Yeah.
Right.
So it just stays the same.
And if you do about 10 sets across a week for a muscle group, so if we were to think of a very basic program, and I'm not sure how far you want to go down the path here. So
let's talk bench press.
Yeah. So
chest.
So like a basic program, there would be a push, there'd be a pulling, there'd be a squatting exercise, and then like a hinging kind of deadlift posterior train leg exercise. And across the week in each of those 4 movement patterns, if you're doing 10 sets that are effective sets, as I just described,
over a 7-day period,
right, over a week, then that is like a minimum threshold to actually promote these strength and hypertrophy
getting
adaptations.
within 2 of failure,
right? 10 effective sets. So you'd want to have 10 effective sets of pushing, 10 effective sets a week of pulling, 10 effective sets a week of some type of squatting pattern, and then 10 effective sets of some type of like hip hinging, like a deadlift.
For your posterior chain.
Right, for your hamstrings. And that's a very kind of just foundational, basic type of resistance training program. You could probably split that into 2 sessions a week and just do 2 full body workouts
of 5 sets each.
Yep. And that's a really great starting point. That's got to be individualized depending on the person. Like my mum, for example, just to tell you a quick story, she's nearly 70 and she's had a few falls. We were in Burleigh Heads about 2 weeks ago walking to dinner and she tripped and stumbled. And thankfully she didn't break a bone or hurt herself, but she could have very easily. And she has done in the past. And I was talking to her about her training, and I think, and this takes me back to my origins in physiotherapy, I think like as we age, our training needs to adapt a little bit. That training program that I just kind of explained, that can be done in a number of ways, and it can be very one-dimensional, right? Which is not translatable to the real world necessarily. So, the old school training of just moving in one kind of plane,
a linear
plane on two legs, so not on a single leg, 3 seconds down, 3 up, which is, it's not a problem. But I actually think we need to introduce into the resistance training program some more kind of 3D elements. So thinking about changing the velocity and the speed. A lot of the time when someone falls, it's not just strength, it's their ability to quickly produce force.
In other words, the fast twitch muscles.
Right. So during the training and during some of these lifts, not always training at the same velocity, having faster movements as well. Being challenged with our balance, and that's introducing other forms of exercise, like, depending on what someone enjoys, but like something like boxing. It's a great cardiovascular workout, but it's also causing the body to kind of be off balance, and you're getting pushed at in sort of awkward positions, and training when you're training and doing squatting patterns or hinging, doing single leg work, not just all bilateral work, so that your balance is a little bit more affected. These are the types of things that I'm thinking about as I'm kind of personalizing a program for someone as they're aging.
So that's quite interesting, because you talked about Mum. Not that long ago, I'm about the same age as your Mum, by the sound of it. And I fell, and I was walking along, and I actually stepped into a hole in the footpath, quite a deep hole, with my left leg, and as a result of it, I fell over, and I felt the pain, blah blah blah. I didn't know anything about it, and then of course, only literally 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago, I thought I'd better go see the orthopedic guy, and he's actually coming on the show in a week or two. He sent me off to get an MRI, and he also wanted to make sure I didn't fracture anything, so I got an X-ray as well. Fortunately, nothing broken. But it turns out I tore my glute minimus tendon, gone off, straight off. Medius, glute medius tendon, partial, and partial tear of my abductor. I was wondering why I was in pain, and why I was wondering also why I was every time I would try to do a squat, stupidly, that my leg kept turning in because I didn't have anything to pull it back out.
Right.
These are your stabilizers, okay, and this is what you're talking about. And they're exercises. I mean, I did box for a long, like million years. And I do jiu-jitsu a couple of times a week now. I've been doing that for a long time. So I sort of do those types of things. But when it comes to actual resistance work, I do that linear stuff that you're talking about earlier on. And of course, that is fixing up your maximus, your glute maximus. It's not helping all those other little things. So and I've always just done the same stuff over and over and over again. And only more recently, I've become more cognizant of what you just said, that I probably need to change it up, single legs, just change it up. But I don't, for someone like me, I actually don't know how to do it. I'd have to go and consult someone like you, or I'd have to go to some guy at the gym, a trainer. So the theory is right. What you said is right. And, we are talking about people who, why this is an important topic, particularly as we get older, is that sometimes people have not got enough stability in their body, and they do fall over and they break a hip. And then we've all heard the story about, the correlation between broken hip and 18 months later, people dying because, over 65. How do people get their head around, okay, what exercises should I be doing in my 60s? I mean, your mum's lucky. She's got you.
Yeah, so if you don't have an individual that you can consult with, because you certainly can go see an exercise physiologist or a physiotherapist, and they'll get you doing all sorts of things.
But we've got a planner, let's say, in the West Suburbs. He's just doing his job, and he's a train driver, and he hasn't got that much money, but he's listening to the show.
Go on YouTube and look for a free yoga or Pilates workout that you can do in your living room.
So Pilates and yoga help this.
Get a yoga mat. Well, I mean, these are going to be working on all those stabilizing muscles. And I'm not sure how much yoga you've done, but balance is a big component of it.
Yeah.
So if you've got the kind of single plane, main sort of push pull squat, hinge down pattern, you're doing that, and you're thinking, how can I make my training a little bit more diversified? How can I improve my mobility, get these stabilizing muscles working better so that I can, overall reduce my risk of having a fall? Because having a fall is not just about the strength, as we've kind of discussed. Then just in your living room, start doing Pilates, start doing yoga. All you need is a mat. There are free courses out there. If you have a little bit of budget, go and do a yoga or a Pilates class in your community.
Okay, so that if I just stop you there for a moment, Simon. So okay, we're in our week, and we were talking about protein. We'll come back to that in a second. But let's say we're doing those 4 exercises you mentioned. Mm-hmm. We're doing 10 sets of those over a week, over a 7-day period. Might be 2 days of 5 sets each. And we're doing that within 2 reps of failure. So we might be doing 6 or 8 or whatever. And so we're doing that. But it's probably not enough. We probably need to consider doing at least 1 yoga class or a Pilates class every week. And it can be online. And as you say, there are free ones. I've seen them. They're free classes online. What is the difference between, you and I know about it, but a lot of people don't. What is the difference between Pilates and yoga? Well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about Pilates on the ground or Pilates on a box or mat Pilates? What are we talking about? What is Pilates?
Well, you can have reformer Pilates.
Yeah.
Or you've had Michael Ramsey on the show, and he has strong, which is a combination of high intensity workout and reformer Pilates.
So here's the strong franchise.
Right. And that's like a hybrid version, which is great, particularly if you're not getting your high intensity work done elsewhere in the week. Another part of, I think, a robust program is making sure you're getting your heart rate up to 95% of max at least once a week, right? So something like strong is a great format for that. But in terms of, difference between yoga and Pilates, I guess traditionally, because these have become more and more similar over time.
They're emerging.
like mat Pilates often, I'll go and do it in Byron, and a lot of it feels like yoga. But then sometimes you'll have weights and so you'll pick up weights and do things, whereas yoga itself tends to be just you and the mat and body weight stuff. But I think they're both similar in terms of they're going to help improve mobility. They're going to help improve balance because there's a lot of single leg work. And they also do help improve strength. There's a lot of time under tension.
Yeah.
Right? Yogis are pretty strong.
Yeah. And time under tension is really important. And with yoga, what you need, maybe you could explain this, but what time and attention means holding a pose, and you can do that even in the gym with weights, by the way. But in yoga, if we just go back to the yoga, that's holding a position for usually 5 breaths in yoga. Depends which type of yoga you're doing, but let's call it Ashtanga or one of those movement yogas. You are holding your position for 5 breaths. Once you get to a certain position, you're holding it, and so that is important for strength. Is that build strength?
Endurance, muscular endurance.
Right.
So it's ability to generate force over time, which is a little bit different to what you're doing in a typical resistance training workout.
Yeah, because the resistance training is more explosive. That's okay. So, now let's just, so that's the activation process of relative to the protein we're taking, because proteins, if I'm doing nothing, if I'm taking protein like 1.6 grams a day per kilogram, and I'm just sitting around all day, probably no point.
It's probably not much better than getting 1.2 grams per kilogram. I mean, you might get a little bit of the benefit on satiety, and perhaps it helps you maintain a better body composition.
Yeah.
But again, there are studies that have looked at what happens to, say, for example, strength as you go from 0.8 grams per kilogram up to 1.6 grams, in two different contexts. One is a sedentary context, doing nothing, and one is doing resistance training. And in the sedentary context, as you increase protein, barely anything happens to strength. Right. Almost nothing.
So, because, for those people who are sitting around thinking, wow, I'm never going to get 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram, but the assumption that is associated with that 2.2, which is at the high end, is probably that you're training like Peter Attia.
Yeah, I'd focus
2 or 3 hours a day.
I'd focus on, honestly, 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram, but get the resistance training in play. And also that's ideal body weight. That should be based on ideal body weight. So if you're someone that is 20 kilograms overweight, you do it based on your target body weight.
Right. Okay. That's important. No, that's very important.
Right. Because it's relative to the amount of skeletal muscle you have. Yeah. Right. So if someone is carrying a lot of excess body fat, then really you should be making that calculation based on if they weigh 100 kilos and their ideal body weight's 80 and that's where they want to get to, you calculate off 80.
So it's 160 plus 18. So 160 plus 16
is like 120 something.
176 grams.
Sorry, if they're 80 kilograms. If you go 1.6 grams per kilo on 80.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you go 2 grams, 160.
Yeah, I was just making quick, easier calculation. But there is an assumption that you're going to be doing a certain intensity in terms of resistance training, and also you're probably putting in a VO2 max day, and you're probably doing, hopefully you're doing some, effort work. In other words, to get your heart rate up to 80% of your maximum. And then you might do one really hard day, but then can I just talk about the protein, the source protein? You raise that source protein, so that's a lot of protein. So let's say I'm trying today to get in. I'll make it easy: 2 grams per kilogram, 176 grams of protein today, which means it doesn't mean I eat 176 gram steak.
No.
What's the general rule of thumb as to in terms of what I've got to consume? And let's just look at meat for a moment, that type of protein, as opposed to protein alternatives, meat alternatives. But just look at meat. So what are we sort of talking about here? Like, how much meat do I need to get? What's a good rule of thumb?
Like if I eat 100 grams? 200 to 150 grams of red meat is going to give you that sort of 30 gram serve.
30, that's all.
Yeah.
That's a decent sized steak.
Yeah.
So, okay. So let's say, I would eat a 250, 300 gram steak. We're going to get, let's say, 30 to 40 grams of protein out of that, which means I now got to get another, on the example, another 135 grams of steak. So I've got of protein. So I've now got to eat pretty much another 3 of those steaks.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I've got to eat 4 250 gram steaks. That's impossible. I can't do that.
Right. And it's a lot of, depending on the cut, it's quite a lot of saturated fat. It's a lot of heme iron. And so this is where, coming back to what outcomes of interest do we care about? Because if you're just optimizing for protein and muscle, then you might go down the path of just eating red meat all day.
When some people profess this, by the way, I have seen these carnivore stories.
But there's really zero long-term studies on that way of eating. So remember, back to kind of the risk calculation.
Yeah.
We have a lot of evidence to suggest that that's increasing risk of colorectal cancer, of cardiovascular disease, perhaps even dementia. So coming back to what's the person's goal here? If it's just hypertrophy, then that's an option. But if you're wanting to optimize protein intake for more than just strength, more than just hypertrophy, the source matters. And this is where sources like fatty fish, Greek yogurt, and the plant-based protein sources, they're going to be better from a chronic disease prevention point of view.
So please share with us some of the plant-based protein sources. And I'm not talking about plant-based protein drinks or powders. Right. I'm talking about...
So let's say 175 grams of tempeh.
Right.
Off the top of my head.
What is tempeh?
So tempeh is made from fermented beans, often soy, but it can be made from chickpea, lupin, etc. Off the top of my head, you get about 30 grams of protein from 175 grams of tempeh.
Not too different to a steak.
Which is about 300 and something calories.
Yeah.
Right. So you can work that into a meal that's within most people's calorie budget. You could put that into a salad and maybe add some whole grains, and you could end up with a 550 calorie overall meal that has 35, 40 grams of protein by the time you calculate protein in those other foods. So tempeh, you have tofu. A lot of people are scared of soy, so we could talk about that if you want, but tofu is a little bit more protein dense than tempeh, meaning you get slightly more protein for less calories. Those would be like the top two, I guess, kind of whole food.
What about lentils?
So lentils and chickpeas and beans are all containing protein. They're less protein dense,
right,
in that they also contain some carbohydrates.
Right.
So they're great to have within your meal, but if you were just eating plant protein, I think you would want to have tofu or tempeh in there as well, so that you can get to that 30 grams of total protein without having an exorbitant amount of calories.
And how about yogurt?
And Greek yogurt, super high in protein.
Yeah, why Greek yogurt? What is that? What do you? Because a lot of people put Greek yogurt on the thing. What are we talking about when it comes to Greek yogurt?
Well, I mean, Greek yogurt is very high in protein, fairly low in fat. So
right.
you can find, Greek protein that'll provide, maybe 20 grams of protein for like 120 calories.
That's pretty low.
Right. It's
low,
pretty low.
Low calories.
So
high,
you could have, 250 calories of Greek yogurt in the morning, and that's 40 grams of protein.
Right.
With some berries and, maybe a little bit of oats, and that's a great breakfast.
Yeah. And you're on your way.
You're on your way. And then most people, to be honest, are adding in a protein shake of some variety throughout the day, simply because, particularly as you get older, your appetite tends to get a little lower. It's
Can you
hard to
explain that? Because what happens to our appetite as we get older?
Some of it is
And what is older too, by the way? Is that
some
40
of it,
or 60?
I consider myself older, so I'm nearly 40.
Oh, mate. Come on. I wish. Let's swap.
Well, I'd love to take your finance knowledge for a day.
Yeah, but I got limited years. You got, I don't know, years for money? I don't know. I think I take years every day.
So I think some of it is probably explained by living a little more sedentary, doing a little bit less movement, which affects appetite. People tend to, are tending to reduce their total caloric intake as they age, particularly as they get over 60 or 70 years of age.
Yeah, that's. I find it quite fascinating that though that because our appetite is lower, but we might be doing resistance work at say we're over 50, we tend, because we don't have appetite, we think, we're not hungry, I'm not going to eat. But therefore, we start to starve ourselves of the right amount of protein and carbs, for that matter, too, and other things that we need to get in a proper diet. So you just said, because we're not hungry, we probably don't feel like another piece of fish or another piece of chicken or steak. We don't feel like having any more chickpeas or tempeh or other things, or yogurt, Greek yogurt for that matter. And then you mentioned protein powder, let's say, a protein supplement, which I use. And I will say straight up that I do put between 5 and 10 grams of creatine in that drink myself, because I'm, I don't know whether creatine works or not, but I've been punched in the head enough in my life to not get worried about my brain.
Right.
So I just think, well, if it works, it works. And it doesn't, as you said earlier, it doesn't seem to be any downside associated with that amount.
Right.
Maybe more than that there could be, but I'm not doing to build muscle. I'm doing more for the nutritional value, potentially, or at least what everybody's saying. But what about the sourcing of that protein, that protein supplement, that powder? I mean, how do I know if I'm getting, let's just look at whey protein for a start. How do I know if I'm getting good quality whey protein?
So how do you know if you're getting good quality?
I sent something to you.
Really, you need a brand that's providing transparency, because the supplement industry it's full of cowboys.
Yeah, out of control. Totally is out of control.
And that's why certifications like in America, the NSF, or over here.
What's NSF?
NSF is a certification in America, and there's NSF Sport now, and you'll see certain brands like Momentous will use that.
I use that brand sometimes.
Use Momentous. I formulated a product, 38 Terra is the name of the company. And it's
I know, I tried that.
You tried it?
Yeah, I've tried it, yeah.
And
I've had it, actually.
So that's like a daily multivitamin for the gut microbiome. Yep. That's NSF certified. And so you'll see more and more brands going down this route of getting NSF certified, and it's because consumers want transparency. because there's been so many cases where what's in the product is not what's on the label.
Yeah.
Either they're not using the kind of clinically proven dose of an expensive ingredient, they've watered it down, or there's these other contaminants or heavy metals, things that we don't want to be consuming regularly in the product. So NSF is like a third-party organization. Essentially, every single batch, if you see NSF
Batch
certified,
testing.
yeah, every single batch, the manufacturer has to be NSF licensed. So they have to be set up in a way that is compliant with NSF to make sure they're not getting cross-contamination of ingredients. And every final product is sent off for third-party testing. And this is important because often brands, they just rely on the certificate of analysis from the individual suppliers. And those certificate of analyses are often not done on every single batch.
So you need to explain a batch though, Simon. So,
okay, so
that doesn't mean every tin of it. That means the batch that those 500 tins came from.
So how a supplement, a company would manufacture their goods is they'd run a 500 kilogram or 1 ton blend.
Yep.
Right. So they put all the raw ingredients into that. And errors could be made. The manufacturer could put the wrong ingredient in, someone else's. Maybe they've got an ingredient from a supplier that was contaminated, has some type of salmonella or E. coli heavy metals, because the supplier was unable to get enough supply, so they went and sourced it from somewhere else. So all these quality issues can arise. And NSF, what that does is it says, okay, well, once that batch comes off the production line,
that 1 ton batch, which is going to get put into kilogram tubs.
Yep. And say you've got 10 ingredients in your blend.
Yep.
Okay, you've blended it all up. Now we're going to send that off and get that tested, and we're going to get it tested for anything that could be harmful. We'll test it for pesticide levels, heavy metals, all of these things. And in the case of NSF certified for sport, it's testing for any performance enhancing drugs, because it has occurred where professional athletes have been taking a supplement and they didn't realize, and they failed doping tests. So in America, if you're in the MLB or NBA or NFL, you can only take NSF certified for sport supplements. And I think just consumers in general, and this is something I advocate for, if you're taking a supplement and you've been taking it for a year or 2 or more, protein supplement, creatine, whatever it is, email the company and ask for third-party testing, because they should have done it, and they should be willing to be transparent to share that information with you. And I do think what's going to happen now, so like on 38 Terra's website, for example, you can put you enter the batch number in, and you get the third-party testing results for that batch. And I think that's where we're going. I think people are starting to realize that the supplement industry at large is a little bit cowboyish.
What about here in Australia? If NSF's American.
So HASTA. HASTA,
how do you spell that?
HASTA,
right,
is the equivalent to NSF.
Right.
Here in Australia, that is doing third-party testing, and is like the kind of equivalent trusted certification for professional athletes.
Right. And to your knowledge, do any supplement companies here, or suppliers here, do they generally comply with this? I mean, do they have to comply with it, or don't have to comply with it? They have to just say...
It adds additional costs.
Right.
But I think because consumers are becoming more and more savvy, brands are realizing that Momentous in America is leading the way, clearly. Right? And they've done enormous amounts of PR about NSF certification. And so what's happening is those companies are kind of paving the way, and you'll start to see other brands realize that, this costs money. You have to pay, a few $1,000s every single batch that you run to do it. But it's something that you can use in marketing. It's a unique selling point. And at the end of the day, you want trust. And what better way to build trust with a consumer to say, hey, we've got nothing to hide. Here's our third party.
And here's our price.
Results.
If you want something quality, this is what you pay for it.
Right. So,
if you don't mind me asking this, Simon, is HASTA as robust and as rigorous as
pretty
NSF?
much?
Yeah. So and is that an Australian entity, or
it's
a government?
Australian organization. I don't think it's a government owned.
Right. So, but it's an independent certification organization, like who just goes and batch tests everything that you pay for.
Right. And they'll if you fail their test, they'll send it back saying it's failed and
Yeah.
you can't use that
You can't sell
certification.
it.
Yeah.
Well, you can't sell it with the certification. And then in terms of where stuff comes from, so let's look at whey protein, and we'll we can also look at vegetable based proteins like pea protein, for example. In Australia, do we produce enough whey and or pea protein to supply the market, our market, or do we have to import that stuff from somewhere?
A lot of it's imported, and that
Right.
can come from China is a big supplier, Europe as well for pea protein. You'll find brands like New Zest source European pea protein.
And is it better or worse? Provenance?
I don't know exactly. So again, here I'm just going off memory. I haven't looked at this recently, but my understanding is that European pea protein has a little bit lower heavy metal content than Chinese.
What's acceptable heavy metal?
But both fall within the acceptable level.
So there's a level at which NSF or HASTA will say, well, that's acceptable.
Correct.
And when we say heavy metal, we're talking about lead,
cadmium,
all those sorts of
mercury.
things. Things that are probably in the soil.
Yeah, and I would say
atmosphere.
for people so they're not feeling really scared of protein here, is that generally the tests that have looked at the heavy metal content of protein, the levels are well within the safe tolerable limit. There's heavy metals in pretty much all the food that we consume, and if you're having 1 or 2 serves of this a day, it doesn't appear to be anywhere near a level where it would be toxic or harmful.
That's assuming you've got the HASTA tag on it or you've got the NSF tag on it, because you could actually be buying a protein shake that hasn't been batch tested and it could have something irregularly high, which is the reason why you should chase down those products with these certifications.
I think you should. I'm sort of becoming more and more of the view that anything you're taking chronically, right? Chronically, like you could be taking the protein for 2-3 decades.
Yeah.
So you've got chronic exposure to that.
Yep.
Well, and you want to set and forget. Find your brand that you trust. So it's a once off. You don't have to be going out and doing this asking for this every single time you buy protein from the same brand. You might do it a few times, but once you find brands that you trust, then it's not something you have to keep focusing on. I would do this with olive oil as well. I just did a 45-minute deep dive on olive oil, and one of the things that really shocked me was how much olive oil is adulterated.
Yeah, we did it. We've also done an episode we haven't released yet, but similar, because we got a professor down who does testing of olive oils, and man, it's crazy. Especially the olive oil that sits at the bottom of let's call it the batch, which they rinse with various chemical agents to release the olive oil out of the shit that sits in the bottom. Then they have to wash the let's call it the contaminants off. And then they put that mix that in with the olive oil that they're calling virgin olive oil, extra virgin oil. It's crazy, especially some of the stuff coming out of Europe. It's a bit scary.
Yeah, I'd be interested to listen to that episode in terms of how he advised people to kind of navigate that.
He didn't.
Did he give any good tips?
We didn't. Largely, he's saying that Australian processes are probably pretty good in Australia. It's sort of the cowboys are sort of existing in some of our better known European countries where the controls aren't as good.
Yeah.
And but he actually did a test where he walked through let's call it one of the big retailers and just selected things off the shelf, well-known brands. And the Australian ones seem to have come out better than, on average, better than everybody
else. That's reassuring.
Yeah.
But, I looked at a US report where they took all these popular extra virgin olive oils in the US and tested them. And there was like 5 things they were testing for that kind of indicated quality. Very scientific things like peroxide value and fatty acid content, polyphenols, all this stuff. And they were looking to see, like, do these meet the criteria of extra virgin olive oil? And many of them failed. A couple of them that were like the most expensive, they actually said were not fit for human consumption.
Whoa.
Right. There were some that did meet the criteria, so I recommended that, which was helpful for American consumers. But I've had a lot of Australians message and say, what do we do? But I guess I think that's reassuring to know that at least the starting point is to find an Australian brand.
Well, you and I might have a bit of fun. Why don't we do a collab and we'll go and get this guy. We'll walk in we won't identify where we're getting it from, but we'll go and we'll do blind testing. We just go and get a dozen olive oils and we'll send it down. There's a place in Wagga, I think it's Wagga. Is it Wagga? Yeah, that actually is the major testing place for Australian oils, just generally. All oils, olive oils and anything else that we consume. And we might even just go down there.
Yeah, we should do that for sure.
It'd be fun. And we won't say who's good or bad, but we'll just blind test. We might taste them and all that sort of stuff. He said to me as a rule of thumb, what's our guy's name again? Professor, what's his name again? Professor Rod Mailer, that's it. And he came down from Newcastle. This is his game. That's all he does. And he said to me, probably the best rule of thumb is don't look for extra virgin. Look for, when it says on the label, robust. Mm-hmm. And the Greeks, where like in our village, they're really good olive oils that are good for you physically and in every way. The village people in the village, I should say, generally say it's a 2-cough olive oil. So it's so robust it makes you cough twice.
Right, it's a bit peppery.
Very peppery. Mm-hmm. So what we tend to see a lot is that they titrate the robustness down to taste, what people will like the taste of, as opposed to if you're looking to have olive oil as, let's call it, a medicine or something.
Right, the health benefits from the polyphenols.
Yeah. So maybe you put the tasty ones, the less robust ones on your salad. But if you want to have 2 tablespoons a day, then try and have the more robust one. So you can do whatever you like. Have those other ones on you, as long as it doesn't have contaminants in it. Just, if you want to put it on your salad. There's no point cooking with it because of the smoke value.
Yeah, I think we should do that. I think that'd be cool. I think it would be helpful for people to know, maybe not the ones that failed, but like what's the best value in Australia for what you can buy that would be the highest quality extra virgin olive oil.
And I don't know if you're probably too young to remember this, but there used to be an ad on radio, I think it was. They used to say, oils ain't oils. And we need to find out which ones ain't the oils. But that'd be fun. Go down to a proper place where they do proper testing.
Yeah.
And that's all they do. That's their deal. This place down in Wagga, I can't remember the name of the joint is. Our guys will know. Right. Sam will be able to find out what the name of the place is. But go down there and let's film it. And you bring some oils and I'll bring some down as well.
And we can see if our own personal experience sensory test matches the lab test.
Totally. But we won't reveal who they are because someone's going to come out as really good and some aren't going to come out so good. But, it's up to Australians, generally speaking, to do their own searching. I mean, if just as I might talk to you about something that just came into my mind, Brian Johnson has released his own olive oil. Brian Johnson, he's a bit of a human guinea pig, to be honest with you. And he's a human experiment in what might be what he considers not dying. I mean, I'm less ambitious. I just want to live to 100 or try. I actually don't want to live to 100. I want to try to see what it takes to live to 100. That's my whole game. Who knows? I mean, I could get struck down on it. Anything could happen. But I want to try. It's a process of trying to live to 100. But he's actually saying he doesn't want to die. But he's released an olive oil. Be interesting to test his olive oil. And we won't say who comes out, who doesn't come out well. But it'd be interesting to test his olive oil relative to all the other ones too.
Well, I can tell you.
You can tell me you've done it?
If you want it.
Yeah. Let me know.
I know Brian, not well, but I have been to his house once for dinner. And when I was doing the olive oil episode, I reached out to him and asked him if he would send me his third-party lab test results. Because there are certain things on the lab results you can look at that give you a fair idea as to, is this extra virgin? Has it been diluted?
Yeah, with the shitty stuff.
Is it robust and high quality because of polyphenol count? And his certainly meets all that criteria.
He does.
So he's done a very good job. It's very expensive. It's like 5 times more expensive.
Yeah, no, like it's $90. I can't remember. Is it $90 a bottle or something? I looked into it.
It's very expensive per serve, but I have no doubt based on those lab test results that it is a high quality olive oil. And maybe he hasn't cut any corners on that.
And maybe you should explain that, Simon. He's not saying, he's not suggesting you buy this olive oil to sprinkle all over your salad. He's sort of saying that if you need 2 tablespoons if that's the recommended dose of high quality olive oil per day, then that's where he's going to, it's expensive because you can get your 2 tablespoons from his bottle to get the
right. He almost sees olive oil as like a medicine.
Yeah,
it's like a therapeutic kind of dose. And most of the literature looking at olive oil suggests that extra virgin olive oil has more benefits than regular olive oil. And the kind of optimal intake is around that 2 tablespoons a day.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about dumping, 5-10 tablespoons a day into your food, because that's an exorbitant amount of calories.
A lot of fat.
Right. So you're trying, what you're trying to do with that high quality extra virgin olive oil is, you're going to get some calories, but you're getting a really high dose of polyphenols.
Yeah, great nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
Nutritional value is very, very high. So my guys have been putting up a little sign, because, they're young guys and they want to know the answer to this. Put it up. Come on. Keep putting it up. Managing, he wants to talk about, and that's our producer today, he wants to talk about managing your stress when you work hard.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the literature saying about that in terms of, I guess it comes down to sleep, exercise, nutrition again, and also your community. But what would you say about that?
Firstly, what I would say is, remember at the beginning I talked about stepping outside of the lane.
Yeah,
this is me going a little bit outside of my primary lane. But I can tell you what I do and what the research.
Yeah, what do you do?
The research that I've read, and I'm sure there's a psychologist or psychiatrist that can build on this.
You're not talking about the psychology, but you're talking about the nutritional and the physicality of
and my lifestyle.
Stress.
What do I do to manage stress?
Yep.
Right. So there's a great body of research. This is outside of nutrition, looking at the benefit of having quality relationships in helping buffer stress. So people that have quality relationships, and when I think of a quality relationship, I think about who are the people that you can kind of surround yourself with, where you can be your absolute self. You can take off the mask.
No one's judging you.
No one's judging you. There's no shame. There's guilt. You can speak about the things you can get things off your chest. You can help them. It's a mutually beneficial connection where you can talk about things maybe that are causing stress, and that person, you trust them enough to share that, this is I think a little bit less intuitive for men. Often, certainly has been in my experience.
Definitely for my generation.
And that person, they might be able to help you. They might be able to offer a different perspective, but also there's benefit in them just listening and you just feeling like you're understood. You're
not looking for a solution.
No, and there's some really interesting research in this space, some that kind of shocked me. That dates back years ago, where they looked at, they basically punctured people's forearms, right, to create a wound. And they were looking at how long it took for that wound to heal. And they had already put people into categories based on whether they had healthy relationships in their life or whether they had relationships with a lot of tension and a lot of unresolved conflict, or in one category, relationships that were unilateral, so caregivers, right, where they were looking after often sick people.
They got nothing back, so to speak.
Yeah. People that were not in a position to give back, not through any fault of their own, but they were often, disabled or very sick. And on average in this study, it took about 5 weeks for the wound to heal. But people who had tension-filled relationships, quote unquote toxic relationships, it took an extra 7 to 10 days to heal. And caregivers, it took even longer to heal, right? And there's been a lot of research done since then to kind of understand the mechanisms. But when you study the biology of people and you look at things like inflammation and levels of oxytocin and neurotransmitters that make us feel good, these are different in people depending on the relationships they have in their life. So people that have really good support networks, healthy relationships, they have less chronic inflammation. They have higher levels of these neurotransmitters that help them feel good. And
when you say neurotransmitters, you mean those chemicals?
Dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin. These are things that give us motivation, drive, happiness. We feel good.
Closeness.
Right. And just to kind of tie the loop back to kind of work-life stress, there's other research that's looked at pain and perceived stress. And this is really, really interesting and important work where they put humans into an functional MRI scanner, and was scanning their brain and subjected them to pain. So imagine like pin pricking into their arm. And they had different conditions. One where that person's just on their own. How much pain do you feel? Then the next is like that person is subjected to the same sensory input, but someone's holding their hand, a stranger.
And they want to see what lights up and doesn't light up.
And they're looking at the areas of the brain that perceive pain. How active are they? And then they look at a third condition where someone you love, maybe it's your daughter or son or your partner, your dad, your mom, someone you love's holding your hand. And what you see is that area of the brain that perceives pain lights up most when no one's holding your hand. It lights up a little bit less when a stranger's holding your hand, and it's least active when someone that you love is holding your hand. And then that research has been kind of built upon by a whole body of research showing that people who work in a stressful environment and have a lot of sort of chronic stress from whatever business activity they have, they actually perceive in their life that they have less stress if they have healthy relationships, right? So if you're someone that's working in a business and your goal is to be a good leader, to make good decisions, to be less irritable, all these things that we think are really important to being a productive person within business, then you should be thinking about relationships as a way to dampen and buffer that stress and actually improve your productivity within the workplace. So I'm not sure if I fully answered your question.
You did. And I might just extrapolate something because I think it's important. The reasoning behind you drawing an analogy with the cut to the arm and the time it takes for that to heal is that's effectively just a stress. You might have an emotional stress, a mental stress, or that's a physical stress. And what you said is that the people who had the close relationships, they healed at a faster rate than the other two categories. And that's an extrapolation, but it's about stress. Stress could be mental, could be physical. You might have injured yourself, whatever. The point is, in all those stressful situations, it's relationships that help you heal or deal with those stresses at a faster rate. Doesn't mean you won't. You're not going to avoid stress.
You're not going to avoid the stress, but you're going to be more resilient to
how well you deal with it.
So you'll be better at recovering. We know that people that are better able to deal with stress have lower risk of infection, or when they get an infection, they heal quicker. So it's about resilience.
I must be doing something right because I've always been a quick, fast healer. I'm happy about that. I feel good about that now. Like you've made me think to myself, well, Mark, there's something going on there. Unless I have some genetic predisposition to heal faster, maybe I've got to thank my mum and dad for that.
And the other bit that I would just add there is there's some other fantastic research looking at ways to buffer stress, and one of the big ones is helping other people.
Yeah,
being of service.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's funny. I was listening to a podcast the other day about leadership, and that individual who's an ex-Navy SEAL, but was talking about leadership. He's also in business, but leadership in business is not about telling people what to do, but it's about having relationships within your business. He didn't talk about outside the business, but having relationships within your business, and having the ability to, and that comes down to how you speak to people. And, your language, the speed at which you talk, how you interact with individuals. And made me just think, because Sammy, our producer, just asked me the question, I'm just wondering whether or not if I might be stressing him out more recently. Because I did actually send him a text yesterday about something which I was just challenging an idea and an idea of the team in here. And I thought, I'd actually listened to that podcast, and I thought long and hard about the language I used in relation to how I put it to them. Long and hard. I put it to them in an email or a text, I can't remember, but Sam will remember. And it makes sense. You've got to have, and by the way, work relationships are important too. It's not just your loved one, your work relationships too.
Yeah. I like the fact that you had the awareness to pause on that.
Yeah.
And obviously you have the relationship where you're feeling comfortable to be able to express those things.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also important that, because we don't want to go the other direction where in business we think, particularly if we're leading a business, where we think that we can't say something because someone's going to get upset and they're going to run off to HR. That doesn't work either. I mean, but and the answer to it is up to the individual who's making the approach to think it through. And it's not about, I don't want to upset them. It's not about that. It's about being effective. The most effective process is to word it properly, time it properly, and respond again and respond again. And if you think that they might have misinterpreted what you said, then respond again.
Right. Yeah. That's something I've had to learn.
Yeah, I've had to learn too.
I often thought that if I love someone, that, I should just sweep hard things underneath the carpet. But if you really love someone, you should figure out a way to deliver feedback that will help them in a way that is not going to be, attacking or argumentative.
Or seen as that. So
I think the piece that you're talking about where you pause a little bit before the communication, I think that comes with age.
Yeah, unfortunately. Well, and as you get older and if you are a leader in your business, that's something you must share that process with others so that they can learn that for themselves too. They may not learn immediately, but they might remember it one day. And by the way, how I grew up in business, during that era, which I'm talking 50 years ago, that was not the process. The boss is the boss. You did what the boss told you to do. That's all bullshit today. That doesn't work. It's just not effective. It's not because of today. That is not the most efficient way of running a business, or indeed having interactions with people in your life. Simon, I really appreciate your time. I've taken a lot of your time, but if I could just recap a little bit of stuff here. So, I think what's been really valuable today that you've told us about is the difference. Well, if we are seeing something that's trending, how we sort of unpack that as to. And the sources of places we can unpack it with. And in my case, as I said earlier, I listen to a tier. I'll go through, subscribe to a tier. I'll go through his episodes and I'll try and find where he's spoken to an expert. I'll speak to Hubman, listen to Hubman, and I'll do the same for you, which is one of the reasons I feel quite privileged to have you here today as an Australian representative of this territory. And so if you're looking at something that's trending, you're not sure about it, and you're saying it's probably at the margin anyway, and maybe not even worth it relative to the risk, go look at, but in order to assess that, go look at someone else who's spoken to someone else about who's an absolute expert in the area.
Right. Yeah.
Is that right?
Be curious. Like being curious
is cool.
Is amazing.
Yeah.
Like I don't want to take that away from people.
Yeah.
Be curious. You found something. It's interesting. You're intrigued. I mean, that life is about being curious. It makes it so interesting, but have a healthy level of skepticism.
Well, and maybe I could just go one more step. Absolutely be curious, but then go and learn. But learn from sources that are persuasive and authoritative. In other words, I mean, that's a proper legal sense, but, we always, whenever I was, practicing law firm, it was always about, well, don't make that proposition, Mark, unless there is authority, case law, that is authority for the proposition you make, and make sure you're able to rely on high court judges or federal court decisions or, English decisions or whatever the case may be that are authoritative on the proposition. And the science is the same. It's evidence-based. Law is about evidence, proper evidence that's acceptable.
Yeah, and if it sounds too good to be true.
Usually it is.
The old adage, usually it is. If it sounds like a quick fix, magic bullet, a shortcut, if it's a shortcut around all of those things we've discussed today, the exercise and the sleep and the relationships, which I think of kind of just like personal hygiene, like brushing my teeth, they're just foundational. If it's a shortcut around those or a distraction from those, just be buyer beware.
So play the long game. There's no quick way there. And then we did talk about, importantly, protein, but also the thing that stimulates protein, which is exercise, and particular types of exercise, which I find quite fascinating. I mean, I was listening the other day actually to Hubman, maybe about 3 weeks ago. He was talking to a Russian guy who trained a lot of Russian Olympians in strength contests, like weightlifters, not bodybuilders, but weightlifters. And he actually said what you just said. You don't need to go to failure. That old adage, train to failure, just doesn't make sense. And in fact, it can open you up to injury, which sets you back for a long time. And it will put you in a position where your body's going to take a really long time to repair. So you're not getting enough time at it.
Yeah, the only evidence that I've seen where training to failure looks positive is in a interesting study that actually came out recently. Was, say for example, you can't do 10 sets across a week, and you're compressed, you're traveling, and you just have like a 30-minute once a week resistance training. In that scenario, it's good to take one set of each of those movements to failure. But if you have enough time to get 10 sets in across a week, I completely agree. The risk of injury is too high. And if you were going to do it, you would always do it on a machine, not on like a free weight.
Right. So something is controlled.
Right. So if your chest press, you'd be on a chest press machine. So that if you go to failure, there's no risk of like something dropping on your neck.
Yeah. Thank God.
Yeah.
And just to close off, how do people find your podcast? And by the way, have you got anyone interesting coming up? Obviously, everyone's interesting, but have you got anything that's exciting? Is there a couple of standout ones we should be listening to? I mean, that you would like to point us to, and where do we find it?
Yeah, so the podcast is The Proof with Simon Hill. You can just search The Proof. That'll come up on YouTube, Spotify, Apple. Some of my favorite episodes to go back and listen to, I'd say Walter Willett, who is a PhD nutrition scientist, most cited nutrition scientist in the world.
Wow.
From Harvard.
Walter Willett.
That conversation I had about 18 months ago in Boston in person with him. And that's probably one of my favorite conversations I've had. So if you want to hear to someone who's just been in, 5 decades working as a nutrition scientist and, cognitively sharp as ever, then jump on that episode. I have an episode with Walter Longo coming out on longevity and some of his research looking at fasting and cancer. And about to release that episode on olive oil. Brian Johnson's teed up to come on, and
does he come on?
He's coming. He hasn't been on my show yet. He's coming on soon. We're trying to organize the date with. Do you know Bill Perkins? Have you heard of him?
No.
He wrote a book called Die with Zero,
which means what?
Essentially, his philosophy is around how to utilize your money during life.
Oh, okay.
And how he thinks you should spend it and when you should spend it. He's optimizing for what he would say is kind of maximum life fulfillment.
Yeah.
Whereas Brian Johnson's kind of optimizing for don't die.
Yeah.
So I'm getting them on to a lot of overlap in what they talk about, but some differences. Those are a few of the conversations that
are coming up.
Yeah.
So we go to The Proof, the podcast called The Proof with just The Proof. If I go on to Spotify and put in The Proof, I get to there.
Yeah.
Which I do, by the way, I wish I do. You're actually on my. What I do with yours and the other two guys I mentioned earlier, I download them so that when I'm on a plane, I don't get sort of locked out, and I can actually listen to those podcasts as I'm going along when I'm flying, especially if I'm on a long trip. Yeah. I can just sort of consume a whole lot of podcasts about health generally. I mean, I listen to other stuff too, but I listen to Joe Rogan, etc. But in terms of health or optimization, I hate the word longevity, but let's call it optimization, which is what I like to talk about, optimizing what I've got. I'm said it about 100 times, but I will tell everybody I do listen to this guy, Simon Hill. I listen to The Proof. I listen to Simon Hill, I follow him, and I listen to Peter Attia, and I listen to Dr. Andrew Huberman, particularly when it comes to the guests that you guys get. I mean, I don't know how you get access to these guys, but you do a lot of your stuff in the US. I know you live in the US quite a bit of your time, 75% or so much is spent in the United States. Is that correct?
Yeah, I moved to LA last year for the show, really.
It's just to get access to people, is it?
Yeah, I joined a network called Voicing Change. Do you know Rich Roll? He's a podcast. Oh, yeah,
Rich Roll, yeah.
He has a podcast, a big podcast in the States, and then he set up a company with like 5 shows underneath it. And so I am underneath that banner.
You're one of the shows under that one.
Yeah, and being in LA is where they record from. And like you said, it just allows me to get a few more of these domain-specific experts on in person.
I had a pre-nouveau over there. I went and did a pre-nouveau.
Okay.
This time last year, March last year. Pretty interesting. I mean, we don't have it in Australia, which is crazy, but like there is one now at the moment called One MRI, but it's not quite the same as the pre-nouveau protocols.
Right.
And what I found fascinating is an MRI. I just should say it's an MRI, full whole body MRI, but it only takes an hour and a quarter. It's not too bad. And then they give you a report, and they're looking for any mass within your body, but they look in every part of your body, like organs, brain, everywhere. It's a bit punishing sort of sitting in the MRI machine for that long, because you get a little weird with all the noises and stuff. But it's amazing how far ahead the Americans are relative to, baselining or getting baselines about stuff, so you can go back and get it looked again in 2 years' time, relative to what we have here in Australia. And it's like that they're 10, 15 years ahead of us in terms of thinking about things. Just like, for example, hyperbaric chambers. Right. So and oxygen in the hyperbaric chamber, and how the sort of things it does for healing. So I just got off a plane, as I said to you, and we have one here, and I'm going to go, not here, there's one up the road here, and I'm going to go and try it and see what it does for jet lag. I'm going to do it tomorrow. But it's like normally for an individual, I'm lucky the guys are arranging me to do it, but normally it's hard to access that sort of stuff. Or I'm talking about a medical grade hyperbaric chamber, not the ones that you might see in gyms in various places, a medical grade one. And all these new things that they're doing in the state, like in the United States, like Gary Brecker, like some of the stuff that he's talking about at the moment. I don't know if it's right or wrong. I mean, he's a human biologist, so I guess he knows more about the science of the body than I'll ever do. But red light therapies, we could be sitting here discussing this stuff for hours.
Right.
But unfortunately, mate, as you know, the Australian audience only has a shorter period that they want to listen to a podcast. It's true.
I did one podcast that was 4.5 hours long.
But and for me, I'm going to have to listen to that over a week. But Americans, they do it. That's the American thing. They do 3-hour, 4-hour podcasts. That's normal. I do listen to American ones, but in Australian ones, we tend to be a lot shorter periods. I don't know what it is.
Maybe fortunately, now there's timestamps.
Yeah, you can kind of flick through it. Yeah, and so I don't want to listen to that part. I'll just listen to this part. But Simon, I really appreciate your time, mate, and it's been fantastic. And we definitely will do the olive oil test in
I want to do that.
I'll get my gang onto it. Okay,
100%.
We'll talk.
The feelings are mutual. I've followed your work for a long time, so it's an honor for me to sit down with you again. And I feel, even though we're in different kind of categories of information, content that we share, I've always admired when I hear you speak, it seems like your highest priority is the welfare of your community. And that's like one of my filters that I try and use for my show, is always having, whether a sponsor comes to me and wants to spend money on the show, it's okay, the health of the listener is first, and then everything flows from that. So thanks for inspiring that.
Thanks very much for that. It is a tough game. This is a tough game, because you got to pay costs and bills, and there's a lot of filtering that goes on that people don't know about behind the scenes. We're doing it all the time. It's if you don't love it, you probably should never try and do it. Like podcasting, you should never try and do it. But I really enjoy myself. We will definitely get down to Wagga, and because I'm really dying to get into one of these places to see how they test all this shit.
Me too.
And just see what the deal is. Like, watch these guys, with test tubes and stuff like that. And you'll know how it all works. You'll be used to that sort of stuff. But for me, I find it quite fascinating. Good on you, mate. Thanks so much.
That'll be fun.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, mate.